Hi there students, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit more about the cultural history of the United States in the first half of the 19th century. And so in particular we're going to look at religion, and we're going to see that just as we've seen with politics, there's what we call a democratization that's process or cultural trend that we see happening in religion. That increasingly there's a turning away from the Puritanism and the Calvinism that had dominated early New England religions, at least, and instead a more positive approach that saw all human beings as able to be saved relatively easily. And we're going to begin with the Unitarians. The Unitarians, it's kind of a rationalization of Christianity. So we've seen a little bit of this with the deist movement in the 18th century. There's this idea that there's a God who created the world. The world seems to be complex enough to need a God, but that God's not really involved in what human beings do. Doesn't come down to earth, doesn't have particular laws that they should follow. The only laws that are there to be followed are nature's laws that God established when he created the world. And the Unitarians are kind of similar. They deny kind of bedrock aspects of Christianity, like the Trinity, like the divinity of Christ, and they deny reading the Bible literally. Instead, they prioritize the conscience of individual human beings. And they say that all human beings are naturally good. They're created by God. They must be naturally good. And they all have a conscience. If everyone follows their conscience, then they're going to be okay. They're going to be saved. And so this becomes, in the early 19th century, quite a popular religion among kind of the elites of New England, who are more skeptical about more organized forms of Christianity. So this is one form of democratization of religion that's taking place. The other is what's known as the Second Great Awakening, that's led by the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. And it's another revival. It's a revival that catapults Methodism in particular to become the most widespread Christian sect in the United States. You go from about 50 Methodist churches in 1780 to around 20,000 in 1860. And so these sects of Christianity in this revival movement that's taking place emphasize a democratic approach to Christianity. They emphasize individual personal experiences. They emphasize reading the Bible literally. They hold these revivals outside in the backwoods as kind of a frontier Christianity, and they encourage people to feel the Spirit, for want of a better phrase, and to be moved by the Spirit. So it's a very positive approach to Christianity. And I don't mean that as necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but just as a difference from Calvinism and Puritanism that emphasize the sinfulness of human beings. And instead, this is an approach that emphasizes the goodness of individual human beings and encourages them to use their consciences to follow the Bible and to follow God. The Second Great Awakening also leads to some new religious groups that emerge. The most famous is the Mormon group. In 1823, a young 18-year-old named Joseph Smith, living in Vermont, claimed that he had a vision of an angel who revealed to him the Book of Mormon, a lost gospel that revealed, in particular, how Americans should live. He condemned activities like drinking liquor, smoking tobacco, drinking caffeine, and he promised his followers to follow him to a new land, a new biblical land that had been granted to them. He also encourages polygamy, and so because of the secretive nature of the early Mormon church, because of this practice of polygamy, which is revolting to many of the Christians at the time, the Mormons are always outcasts. And this is partly also by design. There's an idea on the part of Joseph Smith that the Mormons are going to create their own individual theocratic society with him as both president and high priest. So this is something that really is taking kind of a throwback to early theocratic New England colonies, but it's something that Americans in the 19th century are very suspicious of. And so the Mormons are constantly kind of on the move and being driven out of different places. And in Missouri, Joseph Smith is actually killed by a mob. And so leadership of the Mormons falls on his successor, Brigham Young. And Brigham Young is actually a more successful leader than Joseph Smith. He is more charismatic, he has more of a vision for the group, and he will bring them to the lands of Utah. Still a part of Mexico at that time, but so remote. Mexico is so disorganized at the time that no one's really going to bother them. And it's here around the Great Salt Lake of Utah that we find the Mormon community settling, and through hardship, because they're living in a desert, eventually growing and flourishing. Okay, so we talked about Unitarians. That's what we find in New England. We talked about Second Great Awakening. Talked about Mormons. Lastly, we're going to come to, not quite lastly actually, we're going to come to Romanticism. Romanticism is a 19th century reaction to industrialism, what we talked about last week. Industrialism and a kind of scientific approach to life. People throughout Western civilization, not just in the United States, are struck by the achievements of science. They want to use science to really govern and regulate all aspects of their life. And the Romantics are those who say, no, there are some aspects of human beings that you cannot reduce to science. And so this is the clash between the two visions. Romanticism in America is especially defined by what's called transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, which has religious overtones to it, has spiritual, mystical overtones to it. This is a part of the Romantic reaction everywhere to emphasize personal spiritual reactions rather than experiments in science. And this movement, this transcendentalist movement, rejects organized religion as too scientific, as not liberating enough in the way that the Romantics wish to be, and instead emphasize communing with the individual conscience and communing with nature. So you can see that once again there's what I've called a democratization here, a focus on the individual and the individual's own experiences. And we see this particularly emphasized by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, who are the leaders of this movement. But they influence a romantic flourishing of American literature during this period as well. And not all of that is transcendental. Some of it is influenced by the transcendentalists, but a lot of this literature is, focused on the human person, how the human individual is interacting with different people. So these are the movements in cultural history in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. There's this democratization of religion and this revival and this awakening. And this leads to a lot of reform movements. And I'll talk about these a little more in week 12 or week 13. But what we see is a focus not just on reviving religion, but on reviving and reforming society. So we see movements like Temperance League, we see movements like public education. These developed during the 19th century, and as one of the videos that I've chosen for you this week emphasizes, they are part of the Second Great Awakening, this revival of religion and human philosophy and psychology that we see with the Romantics and their desire to reform and restore American society. So that's a really important current to see running through American society at this time as well. It's not just a democratization that's taking place that emphasizes individuality and freedom, but there's also a real desire to reform American society, make American society virtuous. And that's going to be really influential in years to come as well.